I'd just like to ask people who are really worried about that possibility, what army are the Russians going to use? Are they hiding their best army somewhere? They have a better army in waiting than they have in Ukraine. This is a real opportunity, and I think we have badly damaged Russian combat arms in this war. And the notion that we have something larger to fear has deterred us to the detriment of the Ukrainians. Yeah, and I put principal responsibility on the United States. I think the Biden administration has been a day late and a dollar short. I think the UK government, beginning with Boris Johnson, with Liz Truss, with Rishi Sunak, and Secretary Wallace, have done a fantastic job, probably the best per capita in the entire NATO alliance. But so much more needs to be done, especially if, as the NATO Secretary General said today, he thinks the feared Russian offensive is really effectively underway. But there's an even deeper problem here. NATO ministers were talking about the fact that our own supplies of ammunition have been depleted, perhaps dangerously depleted, by what we've supplied to Ukraine. What that tells me is, certainly for the United States, we have been massively underspending on defense. If our arsenals can be drawn down to such an extent by a war the size of the war in Ukraine, what would we do if we found ourselves in a larger conflict? So there's a serious gap in Western defense here, I think, that's being exposed by Ukraine, let alone what we failed to do adequately to ensure Ukrainian victory.
Just finally, the Ukrainian President Zelensky has been making this plea, as I'm sure you're aware, for combat jets to help counter this expected Russian offensive. President Biden has said at the moment he's not prepared to send combat aircraft. Should the United States provide jets to Ukraine, do you think?
We should have done it last year when the Ukrainians first proposed getting Polish MiG planes, that is to say former Russian or perhaps even Soviet-era MiG planes. Secretary of State Tony Blinken first said, yes, we're going to support that, and then the president himself overruled his Secretary of State, and they've never gotten those MiGs. We are being intimidated by the threat of an escalated war by the Russians, and I'd just like to ask people who are really worried about that possibility, what army are the Russians going to use? Are they hiding their best army somewhere? They have a better army in waiting than they have in Ukraine. This is a real opportunity, and I think we have badly damaged Russian combat arms in this war. And the notion that we have something larger to fear has deterred us to the detriment of the Ukrainians. Well, it was certainly correct to take out the last three as soon as they were discovered, including over land. They made a devastating mistake, however, by allowing the first balloon to cross into American territory and not shooting it down either in coastal waters where the debris would be easily recovered before it reached mainland of Alaska, or over basically uninhabited territory inside Alaska. There's new information that had been vaguely reported yesterday, but now both the New York Times and the Washington Post are carrying it, so we all know it must be true, that the U.S. had been tracking that Chinese balloon, the first balloon, from when it left Hainan Island, south of the Chinese mainland, for over a week. Now, the first report, when the administration finally admitted there was a balloon by that time over Montana, they said that the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, had picked it up first north of the Aleutian Islands, part of Alaska. But now we learn they had known about it for a week beforehand. I mean, that just shows coming from China, unidentified, unpredicted by the Chinese. They didn't call and say, oh, my goodness, we've lost a weather balloon. They thought they could see what happened if it went undetected. To me, that's proof positive that we should have called China and said, you have a balloon coming toward the United States. You either turn it around if it has directional capabilities in the balloon, or we're going to shoot it down. And the failure to do that, I think, has exposed the United States to ridicule and allowed this balloon to test out a lot of American reactions over the continental United States.
So,
We don't know enough to know exactly how serious this is, but this ought to be a wake-up call for everybody in the United States and Europe as well.
so, Ambassador, are you convinced that this spy balloon and indeed those three subsequent objects are all part of a Chinese surveillance program?
Well, we don't know enough out in the public domain about the last three balloons, but and we will certainly know what the first balloon was because today it was reported that our divers had been able to pick up a very substantial part of the payload of the balloon. So we'll find out whether it was thermometers and wind devices or whether it was surveillance and communications equipment. I think that the fact that the Chinese tried to do this is something that I think should be the matter of serious debate around the world. And again, whatever the actual significance of what that payload was designed to pick up, this is a crystal clear example of China's aggressive attitude directly, in this case, toward the United States, but really more broadly around the world.
But yesterday, John Kirby, the White House spokesman, said this kind of surveillance was going on under President Trump. It was operating during the previous administration. They did not detect it. We detected it, he said. What do you make of what he said there?
Well, I think Kirby has proven himself to be a political hack. That was a cheap shot. The administration has now, by my count, said four different things about these earlier balloon flights. First, that they were detected under Trump, then that they were not detected, but that a review of the records indicated they had happened. And then third, that they were detected by the radar, but the radar operators assessed them to be weather disturbances rather than man-made objects. Now Kirby is back saying that they were detected. I can say that I never knew about any such flights during my tenure at the White House, nor did Mark Esper when he was Secretary of Defense, nor did Mike Pompeo as CIA director and then later Secretary of State. Now, I'm going to get to the bottom of this because tomorrow, by coincidence, I'm going to be briefed by the intelligence community. I think I'm the first former Trump official to get the briefing. And I'll have a lot of questions about all aspects of this.
Well, we'll certainly be interested to hear what you learn at those briefings, Mr. Ambassador. But you say that you were not aware of any such flights, and you talk about other colleagues who also weren't aware of them. I mean, if they had been detected, you, as National Security Advisor, presumably would have been informed.
I would be stunned if I hadn't been. And I will say, if there were balloon incursions, in fact, detected, and that information was held within the Pentagon, that would be a very serious problem, a very serious problem. But what the Biden administration is trying to do is lay off responsibility to the Trump administration, saying it's nothing new. It happened back then. They didn't do a very good job. Nothing to see here. Quietly passed by. So we can get back to what the Biden administration really wants to do, which is negotiate climate change agreements with China. This is an opportunity for us, really, for people to understand the nature of the Chinese threat and the administration's conduct during this period, the conflicting, confusing, changing explanations they've given to the public, I think show they don't have their act together. And I think one piece of evidence on that very clearly was the first detection they admit to over the Aleutian Islands took place on Saturday, January the 28th. The president, by their own admission, was not briefed until Tuesday the 31st, 3 days later. I am absolutely stunned by that.
So if the United States does establish that the Chinese were behind this, they're looking at some of that equipment which has been recovered from that initial suspected spy balloon. If it is established beyond perhaps reasonable doubt that this was part of some Chinese surveillance operation. What should the US response be?
Well, people say, what difference does it make? We all have satellites in the sky. And that's true. But it's also the case that up until 2019, the United States and Russia had what we call an open skies agreement that allowed for flights over each other's territory under certain prescribed conditions. And one of the last things that I did before I resigned from the White House was start the process going for the United States to withdraw from that open skies treaty because the Russians were abusing it. And in fact, the administration later did withdraw from it. We have no such treaty with the Chinese at all. And while it's been true since the time of Sputnik that satellites are outside the atmosphere, inside the atmosphere, that's sovereign territory. And the fact they were doing this and lying to us about it is, I think, pretty good evidence to what the Chinese were actually up to. We'll know definitively when they look at the equipment.
We know that the UK Defence Secretary is now reviewing the potential threat of these sorts of surveillance balloons. We've got stories in our newspapers here in the UK tonight talking about how Chinese technology might be used in closed-circuit TV much closer to the ground. Do you think that countries like the UK should now be looking again at the potential threat from Chinese surveillance in the light of what has emerged?
Yes, as I say, I think this balloon episode is still inexplicable for many reasons. Why they had to use a technology sort of reminiscent of barrage balloons in World War I. And that suggests there may be something else going on here with the balloons that we don't appreciate yet. But the fact of the surveillance itself should alert us that across the board, China is trying to gather information from Western societies. Companies like Huawei and ZTE are not telecommunications companies. They're Chinese arms of the Chinese state trying to get control of fifth-generation telecommunications. Even seemingly innocuous internet apps like TikTok are ways for China to gather information. And, we can wake up to it now while we have time to prevent the damage, or we can suffer the damage and may not ever be able to recover from it.